Good afternoon to all of you. Well, this is always a difficult time for any conference, but I think the subject is so interesting and spicy, and we have here three members of the panel that I'm sure can say very interesting things about what our session is entitled Inequality and Governance. And first of all, I want to introduce the three panelists. The first is Mari Kaldor, professor of global governance in the London School of Economics. She has been a pioneer on the study and research of new wars and global civil society. She has been advising Javier Solana, yeah. I understand, good friend, excellent friend, and now Federica Boverini. And well, she is very well known, author of many interesting books about the subject that I have just referred, as also not only a thinker, but an activist too, and very engaged person. It's for me really a pleasure to be with you in this panel. Ibon Zugasti, that is my compatriot, coming from the Basque region and director of Protectionism. He's the chairman of the Millennium project in Spain and the vice president of Foresight Europe network. He has also, if you allow me to say it, very strong links with the cooperative movement in the Basque region, but it's something that we are very proud of, and I think is really a social model for can we say, also for us as Europeans. And we are very happy that you are with us. And finally, Stijn Hoorens, that is Associate European Director of RAND Europe and Director of the Brussels office, and has been working also with us in ESPAS. As you know, RAND is a non-profit research organization that helps to improve policy and decision-making. So about the session of this afternoon, I understand that it has been a subject that yesterday and today he was mentioned many times, can we say as background of many of the discussions that had been held in other parts of this program. I was yesterday with Bruce Stokes, that was later with you with us in the session, and he was presenting a Pew research study on the US elections. And it was a very interesting one because about the question about how you think are the most important issues for the nation, for the US, among the American voters. This research shows that the first issue, and it's very clear, is the gap between rich and poor. And things like racial issues, like crime, like terrorism, even as migration, are later than this first one. So it just shows what I didn't surprise me. I think that this increases awareness of all the public opinion and the ordinary citizen about the increase in inequalities. It's very clear that this top 20% getting more and more, and can we say a bottom 20% getting less and less. I will stop there, but I think is a very sensible public opinion, and I think the fact shows that it is really like that. But just to be very short, because I want that our panelists and our speakers can have the opportunity to develop. If you allow me to say that, as moderator, you can have 4 or 5 minutes, if you like, for your first introduction. After that, we try to have a conversation also with you. We are looking for the trends to 2030. So can I ask you three, can you agree that income and wealth inequality are rising? I think the answer is yes. But also, I want to know your particular comments about. Is there a trend that can be stopped or will be widened in the years to come? What is your opinion about? And what is the practical consequence that we have on politics, on social and economic issues? Can we say, can just as a first round introduction. Mary, can you begin about that, please?
I want to talk about, which is exactly what you've asked me, is the implications of inequality for governance. And I think, as you just pointed out, the votes for Brexit and for Trump were, in a way, cries of anguish from the losers of globalization. Of course, the story is more complicated than that, and there were other groups, but that's the central message. And the slogan in the British Brexit debate was "Take back control." Mm-hmm. It was a cry of anguish for those people who felt they had no control over their lives. Now, as it turns out, what actually is happening is that control is being taken, probably in both countries, but especially in Britain, by a small right-wing clique. The people who voted are not going to get more control, and I think the results are going to be very disappointing for them. It may be that Trump will do some great infrastructure program, but I think there will be economic stagnation, there will be inequality, and the responses will be more and more to blame the other, xenophobia and violence. So this is very dangerous, and I suppose the first thing to say is that this take back control was a myth. I want to say in my brief 4 to 5 minutes that actually I think the only way to take back control is through being a member of the European Union, being a part of a regional organization. And I want to but it doesn't mean the European Union as it is now. It means a different kind of European Union, and I want to say something about that. Just first, a very brief word about history, why we're in such a mess. Lots of people have said the European Union started as this peace project, and the Monnet method was to use economic means to bring us ever closer union. Up until 1991, the Monnet method was socially redistributive. It involved regional assistance, agricultural policy, which was a kind of social policy for farmers, and so on. From 1991, the project was the single market instead. And it was a very different sort of project. It was the moment when neoliberalism came to the fore. It was a wonderful compromise between the Europeanism of Delors and the neoliberalism of Mrs. Thatcher. And every economist at the time said you can't have a single market without a big federal budget, without a fiscal mechanism. And so the question is, and if you have it, it will lead to huge gaps between debtors and creditors. It will lead to greater inequality. So the question is, was this a mistake? Now, the late Ulrich Beck, I was going to say this because I thought Edgar was still in the room, who worked with him, said it wasn't a mistake, it was a continuation of the Monnet method. They knew it would produce a crisis, but they thought that out of this crisis would come a political union. And that hasn't happened, and that's the crisis we're in. So what has to happen to get out of it? And I just think this is an existential moment when we have to think big about the European Union. I think we need, in order to take back control, I think we need to think of the European Union not as an intergovernmental organization, not as a superstate, but as a model of global governance whose job it is to control and regulate the bad sides of globalization and promote the good sides so that as much power as possible devolves to local levels and enables people to take back control. It's a sort of civilizing of globalization. So it has to protect them from the storms of globalization, financial speculation, tax avoidance by multinational corporations, climate change, and it has to promote global goods, peace in the neighborhood, resource saving, overcoming poverty. This morning, Brigitte Laffan said we need an infrastructure project like Trump's proposing, but she said it has to be limited because of public financing. I think we need large-scale public financing, and how would we do it? By taxes on global bads, a Tobin tax, a tax on multinationals, a carbon tax, and so on. A whole family of new taxes that would then enable the European Union to overcome big differences. And I think unless we do that, what's happening at the moment is really, really dangerous. It's really alarming. I mean, Europe is a sort of little island of civility surrounded by right-wing authoritarian populist regimes, and Europe will succumb too unless it rises to the challenge.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think that, well, we will follow up on, they have taken 3 or 4 issues that can develop from your comments, and thank you. Ibon.
Thank you, Luis. Well, my main point today is that when we are analyzing complex issues like inequalities, we need complex tools. So I like very much what ESPAS represents. I think I have read the reports. I think they are very good. But I think we need something else. I think trend analysis is a very good tool. We work a lot on Delphi. I mean, consultation to experts is great. These events are wonderful. But when we are tackling with complex issues, we need complex tools like scenarios. So coming to the issue, in the Millennium project, we have just completed a research on the future of work and technology. Yesterday we were talking about that. For instance, it was mentioned yesterday that the World Economic Forum has completed also this year a similar study, but was mainly based on a survey to multinational companies. What we did was to analyze the issue from a complexity approach. So first thing is, this is not inequality. Inequalities is not an issue that you can say, we have a problem and we will start a strategy. That's it. It's a very complex issue. In our research, future of work and technology, we link it totally to inequalities. Because our starting point is the following. First thing is concentration of wealth is increasing. You said that. And as a result of that, income gaps are widening. This is clear. But then, employment-less economic growth seems to be the norm. So we see that we grow, we have economic growth, but we don't have more stable and sustainable employment. Return on investment in capital and technology is usually better than labor. So what do companies do? They invest more in capital and technology than in labor. And future technologies can replace much of human labor. Yesterday we were already talking about that. But what's the link of this with inequalities? And especially, Luis, you were making the question, what will be the future prospect? So we have designed 3 different scenarios, because as you know, in Foresight, we don't have a unique future. We always talk about alternative futures. So a first one, it's called it's complicated, a mixed bag. So we have in a scenario where we are combining some countries where they have anticipatory approaches, and thus they are facing the issue from a long-term perspective. We could see that in that scenario, some of the countries, they are already developing guaranteed income systems, and also long-term responses to these big challenges, but others are not. And there is no systemic overall response to this big global issue. There is a second scenario where that we call political economical turmoil, future despair, which is the most negative scenario. Here, I mean, basically, nobody is addressing the issue from a complexity approach. So basically, we think, I mean, like yesterday, it was mentioned these black elephants, that everybody can see the problem, but nobody is addressing it. So inequalities grow a lot. There is a big chaos situation in the world. Governments and authorities, they are not facing the issue. And we had the third scenario that is called if humans were free, the self-actualizing economy. This is by 2050, and this means that, well, there is let's say, disruptive change. So this is not something we can face with small strategies, with small changes. There is a radical change where we make people see that they have to have their own individual, personal, long-term perspective. And of course, the governments are also acting in this long-term perspective way. And there are strategies that are facing these long-term challenges to try to fight this growing inequality. That's the overall idea.
Thank you very much, Ibon. Stijn, please.
Yeah, so, well, to start with, we've been involved in ESPAS for a while, and our work, when we looked at some of the societal challenges that are facing, that Europe is facing, that work fed into the report that was published about a year ago. And I'd like to start now essentially where the previous session and actually sessions before that ended, with Brexit, with the American elections, the rise of anti-establishment movements in France, Wilders in the Netherlands, AfD in Germany. Many of those movements have been attributed to predominantly white, low-skilled contingent of people who have lost out on globalization and have been hit probably hardest by the European crisis, by the crisis. And analysis of electoral results, we just discussed that, indeed show that those votes, the anti-establishment votes, populist votes, what have you, tend to correlate with a high prevalence of low-skilled workers and a high prevalence of unemployment. Think about France, for instance, the region of Picardy, the Netherlands, the province of Limburg, the Rust Belt in the US, the Midlands, the north of England, and so on and so forth. All regions where that have seen the disappearance of manufacturing jobs in recent decades. Now, recent publications have indeed showed and suggested that, say, the lower middle class in rich countries have been one of the most prominent losers of globalization, and I think one of the most compelling ones is the very recent publication of Branko Milanovic, who actually contributed to our study back a few years ago as well, and he showed a very compelling image that has by now come to be named as the elephant chart. And I'll try to explain it in a mirror. It's named after an elephant because it's depicting the relative gain in income for globally on the y-axis and on the horizontal axis by the global income distribution. And why it's called the elephant chart, because the poor on the left-hand side have benefited over recent decades, but the big winners have been, say, the Asian middle classes. So that's the head of the elephant, up until the 70th percentile, and then it dropped dramatically. And so those between the 70th and 80th, 85th percentile, incomes have not grown over the past 3 decades. So it shows the difference between 1988 and 2008. And then it starts rising steeply again for the richest 5%. So it's that trough here, the low part of the trunk of the elephant.
In the low part.
Sorry?
No, I forgot I could.
That Milanovic coins the decile of discontent, and it is them who have really been, say, labelled as this group of predominantly white, low-skilled, lower middle class groups in the West. So the question is globalization to blame for this, and is this the price that we've had to pay for, say, the rise of Asia, or to put it in Trump's words, all the manufacturing jobs that have gone to China? I would say that certainly globalization is one of the drivers, but there are a lot of factors at play, binning trade agreements and throwing up trade barriers is unlikely to reverse this trend, because there are a number of other trends at play, and I'll just mention two of them. Skills on the one hand, and household types. First of all, skills. The effects of technology, the benefits, but also the risks have been discussed various times today and yesterday. But it also has a polarizing effect, and indeed, technology may boost productivity gains. It may boost demand subsequently, and have economic and even on aggregate positive employment outcomes. But the second-order effects and the disaggregate effects are much less clear. And for example, jobs that are based on manual tasks or cognitive tasks are much more susceptible to automation, whereas jobs based on creative and social intelligence and critical thinking are much less susceptible to automation. So, as a consequence, unemployment in the long term is expected to grow, particularly for low-skilled jobs. And it's not just the total number of jobs that are affected, but the earning gains from productivity are also concentrated, particularly in the higher income workers. I also mentioned household types. 1 in 4 Europeans is at risk of poverty and social inclusion at the moment, but it's actually some living in specific types of households are much more at risk. And the risk factors are pretty clear. It is single parents, in particular single moms, single-person households, and households with elderly people over the age of 65. And it's those very types of households that, over the next decades, their share is projected to increase as a proportion of the total population. Increasing divorce rates, changing attitudes towards the family, changing gender roles, population aging, all of those contribute to a larger share of much more vulnerable households. So just very quickly back to the elephant in the room, or to the elephant. I think it's too simplistic to just blame that only on globalization, and squeeze that and blame that for the squeezing of the middle class in the West. I think it's the interaction of multiple dimensions of inequality, whether it's the age gap, whether it's the skills gap, whether it's the income gap, gender gap, and so on, even a migrant gap. They all contribute to a vicious cycle for vulnerable groups, and that run the risk of becoming trapped in poverty and social exclusion. So, if you ask me, then and there is one challenge that should be tackled, then it is breaking this cycle. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stijn, and thank you to all of you three about your comments. we are talking about one subject. You had three different views, but I think there is one point in common. Mary, you mentioned the fact that EU is a, can we say, our response and our human and civilized response according to our liberal values to the globalization process. And I can but fully agree with you. And that means, you mentioned internal market, that means, it's not working? Okay. I say that that means social market economy, that means inclusive growth, to take both of the EU concepts. I think that in both senses we can see clearly that we try to have a model of response, and it's very, very shocking, the fact that this model of response has been rejected by public opinions and is being rejected. So what can we do to have a, can we say, public response to this fact? You mentioned tax issues, but it's also about quality education. There is about housing that you were referring, Stijn. So can you perhaps develop on that how we can go one step forward in this sense? You mentioned also great projects as a way of response. Can you develop on that, Mary? Is there a way that perhaps there is no universal response, but have we other response to try to revamp the European project that is, can we say, more close to the citizen, that is being seen, as you said, as our response to the global phenomena?
Let me say, of course, and that's the thrust of my remarks. But let me say first, I think we're at a moment in history very similar to the 1920s and 30s, when the old model of development, which was based on mass production, consumer goods, plastic, oil, is coming to an end for a whole variety of reasons. And there is the possibility of a new model which could be just as successful as the old model. And in my view, it would be a model that married information technology to resource saving. That, I think, is what the new model has to be, because otherwise we can't tackle climate change. But also, whereas productivity gains in the previous model were based on labor, we've reached the limits of those labor productivity gains, but we could make, in the future, great productivity gains from resources. And that seems to me where the future lies. And to promote this new, the old nation state was actually part of the old model. It was statist, it was state-directed. I agree about it not all being due to globalization, though, of course, what on earth do we mean by globalization? Everybody has a different definition. But I think it was political as much as anything. We shifted from a Keynesian welfare model to a neoliberal model, but probably with the shift in technology and the shift, it would have been hard to sustain that anyway. So actually, in order to promote the new model, we need a new type of institution. And I think perhaps, and the EU has the potential to be that type of institution. It isn't there yet. And that's really the challenge, I think, that we're facing at the moment, is can we be really bold and transform the European Union at this moment? And I think being bold does require addressing the issues of democracy and accountability, the feeling that people have that the Union is so far away, and thinking in quite imaginative ways of new ways in which the citizen can feel that they've got a greater control over their lives.
Thank you very much, Ferry.
Yes.
Coming to your
question, Luis. I think that, of course, we have to give European responses. Europe is the region in the world that has less differences, less income gaps. And by the way, Latin America is the region in the world that has the highest differences. And we speak a lot on this issue in Latin America. But the point is, if I look to my region, for instance, the Basque region in the north of Spain, we have a Gini index similar to Sweden, which is the best in Europe. But our fiscal pressure is less than the average in the EU. So we are not facing the issue from with the taxes only, also with the taxes, but not only with the taxes. We have some other drivers that are, we have had a guaranteed income system for 25 years already. We have a very large social economy system. I come from Mondragon Corporation. This is a company with a turnover of 11 billion euros. We are 70,000 people working worldwide with a system of one worker, one vote. Economic democracy, it's feasible, it's profitable, it's democratic, it's sustainable, it's possible. So we can have solutions to inequality. My point is, what are we facing next? So this fourth industrial revolution that we are facing now means that we will face an exponential change. It's not a gradual or a trend change. It's a huge change what we are facing. So the response is, we cannot just say, let's invest a little bit more in education, let's go a little bit more for research and development, we need real big changes in the whole system. And we need a new decision-making system at European level, and we need to understand that change. If we think that this is just one trend, then if we start making the changes in 2040, it's going to be too late for 2050. So, and this is a very complex issue because it's not, I mean, these 2 days we've been talking a lot about Trump, and I'm not talking again about Trump, but this is not something that someone, a big economy, a big player is changing their policy, and this is very relevant. But this is, we are talking about a technological change that is not something that one person or one country is leading. This is a whole overall change. And we know that the business as usual scenario is that it will create a huge, massive unemployment. This is what the experts said in our Delphi survey. So, what we can do, for instance, in the US, they said, let's go for protectionism. So short-term responses. Let's try to have taxes to imports. Let's try to close our market. Let's solve the problem that way. And the citizens, when they were voting, they thought, look, I have this problem. Let's vote for this person because they are giving short-term solutions. But this is something more complex than that. So we really need to change the whole thinking, understanding, and decision-making. It reminds me of a research project we have just finished for DG Research here on Foresight on another very different issue, that is the water, energy, and food security nexus. And this whole nexus, this is something that you cannot understand from a linear thinking. This is not something you say, okay, there is this problem with the nexus, and let's change our sustainable development strategy. This is something very complex because the whole world is affected. We have the water system and the like the crops we are using for renewable energies that are improving renewable production, but at the same time we see that they are creating problems with water and with soil. So The way we understand this nexus challenge cannot be from a simple approach. It has to be from a complex approach. And the same goes to technological change and the impact it could have in inequalities.
Thank you, Ibon. Stijn, about policy responses, you have mentioned some of the issues, perhaps shortly.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. I mean, I mentioned breaking the cycle. So I think that's what I want to focus on, even though I'm sure tax systems can go ways in say, repairing some of the problems. I think breaking the cycle there, it's all about education. And just to address some of the key points there, for household types growing up in a single-parent household, for instance, just is associated with, on average, of course, with poorer labor market and education outcomes. So early intervention, the earliest possible there, will have massive benefits in the longer term. The other angle is on the skills side. I mentioned earlier there's a skills divide, and it will further exacerbate going forward. So what we need to make sure is that our education systems deliver the skills that we need in our future economy. I mentioned the types of skills that are more subject or more vulnerable to automation. So we just need to simply make sure that our education systems, our universities, our high schools, focus on those skills that are needed. Creative, social intelligence, critical thinking, and so on. And finally, the traditional education systems has been swapped around because of the changing environment, changing labor market. We need to learn and continue to train over our active career. So there, I think governments can go a long way in facilitating lifelong learning and helping workers to train up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. It reminded me of the very refreshing words yesterday by Commissioner Carlos Moedas when talking about innovation yesterday morning and how we have to do a bridge to give opportunities for all citizens in the way that we in research and development, and how we can provide, can we say, more opportunities for citizens trying to develop what you have said just about quality education and the other aspects that are support, I think, that the fight against the rising inequality. We want to do this session as a dialogue between us, as a conversation. So perhaps it's the time to open the floor to some of you. But I think there are some members of the talent network around here. Can you identify yourselves and to put a very short question, please? Please.
Thank you very much. Nereo Peñalver from the European Parliament and member of the ESPAS Young Talent Network. A really concrete question divided in 3 parts. Professor,
if you can ask one, there is more room for the other.
I'll be really fast. Professor Kaldor mentioned that under President Delors we had an agreement, we had the deepening of the single market that was coupled with cohesion funds and social funds. This does no longer seem to be enough for Europeans in many regions to feel protected or shielded from globalization or its bad effects. My question is, how should the new European deal look like, in your view? And is it possible to think of an EU-wide unemployment scheme or a basic income? In that case, which concrete steps should be taken to make it possible? And what role for fiscal and social harmonization of policies? And in the case, as Mr. Ibon said before, in the case we have less workers in the future, we will need to compensate the income from work with new taxes. Shall we think about bold initiatives like taxing the robots?
if globalization does not necessarily get itself right by itself, there would be a case for globalization to be managed. So could this mean that sustainable and inclusive globalization management would become an utmost policy priority at EU level, possibly also at others? That's the first one. Second, on the nexus, we are looking regularly at a couple of such nexus. So water, energy, food security is just one. There are about half a dozen out there. Usually they are technology focused. Should we, when we look at such nexus, systematically add equity to those nexus?
Inequality plus democratic governance lead to unsustainable policy choices, which you could argue we see right now in the US, for instance. And what would that imply when we are confronted with increasing inequality because of labor market changes we've heard about a lot today, automation and so on and so forth, on the one hand, and planetary boundaries on the other hand, like climate change or the water, food, energy nexus we've heard about so far? Thanks.
I didn't get that.
Not sure if I'm the best person to comment on that. I would like to comment on something else, if that's okay. And that is on, say, the taxing the bad, which I think is, Ms. Kaldor's mentioned that earlier, is a way, kind of a new business model, right, of funding our public sector because we have fewer workers, and so hence our, say, traditional public sector funding model is shrinking. I think that's it's definitely important to think about that and what should be those, say, dimensions or those bad outcomes that we need to tax. One thing, again, to bear in mind there is that a lot of the bad things that we tax at the moment, think about bad behavior like alcohol, calorie consumption, or tobacco, lies primarily with the burden of that lies primarily with the lower income groups. So we have to be very careful that we don't, say, overburden particular groups with that system.
My aim was to overburden the richer groups.
Yeah.
And if I could...
Mary, you have the floor, but can you comment on the globalization and the management is something that you have written a lot about.
Yeah.
But very shortly, please.
Well, what I actually want to say something about, we're being awful not taking your instructions, is that
It's not a problem.
the character of Max Weber said the character of a political institution depends on how it's financed. Mm-hmm. And the classic, so we tend to have local government tends to be financed by property taxes, local property taxes. National government tends to be funded by income tax. Now, what has happened since 2008 is that particularly the United States and Britain, and I think that's what makes them different, they've increasingly become financed through the city, through borrowing. And I think that has created rentier states. And that's the problem the political problem that we're facing. The United States and Britain have become a bit like the Middle East or Russia, who depend on oil revenues. In their case, it's finance. And that's why you have this incredible political competition that lacks any programmatic content for access to the money. And I think the deregulation of capital, the spread of finance, the effect that financial markets have on policy, which have really made it impossible for governments to take socially responsible policies, that's what we've got to regulate, and that's what a people's deal has to involve. We really have to reduce the share of finance in relation to the real economy, and we really have to insulate local economies from financial markets. We can't allow young men on their laptops to determine whether or not we introduce welfare benefits. It's totally undermining democracy, which of course we've seen in a very clear way in the case of Greece.
Thank you, Mary. Ibon, the last question was about inequality, democracy. Can you perhaps comment on that?
Yes,
very shortly.
it's
a very vast topic, but just two or
yes.
three ideas about.
Yes, I slightly disagree with what you have said. I think in our case, in the Basque region case, the evidence shows that even having lower corporate and richness taxes or whatsoever, we still have higher equality. So this shows that taxing is not the only way. It could be one way. Scandinavian model, it goes more with higher taxes, but not only with that. Of course, there is much more behind, like the Finnish case. It's clearly a long-term vision, an approach to education. But anyway, if we go to taxing, in our Millennium Project survey, the experts suggested that there should be taxing to robots, like it was asked here. So there was a clear idea that there is this cause and effect link, like you said with other taxes. There is a harm by robots, and then there should be some taxing there that we use for guaranteed income, for instance, but not in the simple way of saying we get some money, we give it to people who are unemployed. In the idea that we need to make this big change, and people themselves, they have to be aware that the future will be very complex, and that they have to change almost their living strategies towards a lifelong learning approach that means a continuous change and adaptation in their own professional lives. And then coming to the other question on Nexus, and also it was mentioned the climate change, I think it's a very similar answer. I mean, with climate change, it's again, this is something we see when we talk about growing greenhouse emissions. This is clear, it's quite clear for everyone, but still we are not addressing the issue. We need radical change because it's a huge challenge. So there were many strategies suggested for the Nexus issue, but we need a systemic solution for it. If we just give a strategy in Europe and a different one in Latin America, it won't work. So we really need to have this systemic approach.
Okay, we have time. Perhaps there was 1 and 2 questions, 3. Okay, very short ones, and we try to 1, 2, and 3, please. Yes, you can identify yourselves and ask one very short question, please.
Okay, my name's David Price. I written a number of books on Schuman, and I run the Schuman project on the origin, purpose, and future of the supranational community system. I want to follow up what Professor Kaldor said about EU being a model. And Schuman himself said that it was a model for the rational reorganization of the world, which is a big thing. And originally he promised that the employment would not go up within the community, that the standard of living would rise, and also that there would be a democratic system, which was in a document which has been buried in the French Foreign Office for several decades, which is called the Charter of the Community, now, which describes what a supranational democracy is. Now, when I last asked the question, I didn't find any think tanks or anybody else who's studying these, and I wonder whether it's maybe about time to discuss, seeing that the trust in the European system is falling to continuously, whether to go into some of these questions from the foundation of the community and see what success we had, beginning with the Charter of the Community, the coal and steel community, which finished in 2002, and looks what's happened to our steel and coal industry since then.
Thank you. Please.
Eiman Noonan, Global Trends Unit, European Parliament Research Service. My question goes back to this wealth tax, transaction tax. Globalization has been blamed for a lot, but globalization, as in the rise of China, was probably not a big factor in the credit crunch. That seemed to have been a homemade disaster. perhaps globalization in the sense of open movement of capital or absence of regulation. So the question is there, do you anticipate a rethink of this dimension of free movement of capital? What's your prognosis, I'm directed mainly to Mary Kaldor, what's your prognosis on the likelihood that we will have a transaction tax, taxes on M&Es and a carbon tax? And finally, what's the likelihood that the European Union will take the lead on these issues? Just a little factoid from a Commission publication that multinationals pay 30% less tax than single country companies. That's from a Commission document, and that shows in itself a certain inequality or inequality of treatment, which is presumably something that people respond to and question.
Thank you. The last one.
Okay, Pierre Calam. Well, systemic change means change of mindset. Otherwise, we remain at an incremental level, which means a change in concepts and in change of the training of the people. The main obstacle now is first the concept. People talk about economy, but we should talk about economy, which was a word which was used before the Industrial Revolution, when the challenge of the limited natural resources was the first point which Marie addressed. So it's no use to build a new oxymoron. You just have to come back to the past concept, the way to manage the common home. And looking at the training, for example, multidimensional currency, which is obvious. I mean, you cannot manage with one currency what you want to spare, which is fossil energy, and what you want to expand, which is work. What the obstacle to that? It's just the kind of training of our professionals. So how do we address the issue? We will never put new wine in old goats. The gospel said that 2,000 ago.
Thank you very much. It's very unfortunate that we have to wind up the discussion and the session, but it's like that. We have been given 60 minutes, and I try to be strict. Well, we have begun with 5 minutes delay, so we have 3 minutes more, and perhaps inspired by the comments on the questions, Stijn, Ibon, and Mary, can you comment on that, Stijn? You want to make some comment about the last interventions? Is your last say this afternoon?
I'll just pass for a moment.
Oh, that's very generous. I have seen that very few times. Congratulations for that. Ibon.
Well, I think it's difficult to answer in 1 minute, but we see that in some cases, the response to this inequality situation is protectionism. And I personally think that protectionism is as bad as bad globalization. So it's a very short-term reaction to a problem. I've been several times in the US this year, and I think there is a very, very difficult situation with inequality. The US is the country and the region where inequalities are growing more, and they are not capable of facing the issue. They think the protectionism could be a good strategy in the long term, but it is not. It is not, because it's not a matter of China competing and financial transaction. It's not only that. It's also that, but it's not only that. In the long term, you need a structural change. And this is what some people in the US start seeing, that they need a new economic system. They need more social economy that we do have in Europe. They need a new taxation system also, but they need to change that. And it's an overall integral change. It's not just the tax to the financial transactions or having higher taxes to Chinese imports. So this is something in Europe that we are very fortunate that we have this social cohesion system. We have to understand that we have to reinforce the system with a long-term view, especially in this framework of the fourth industrial revolution that it's coming.
Thank you, Ibon. Well, Mary, it's
one
so many things, but you are a professor, you have the capacity to do a very short abstract. So.
Okay, first of all, the question on Schuman. Yes, I think those founders did invent a new model, and Europe has been a great source of political inventiveness. The nation state was invented in Europe, but the nation state, as well as its good sides, produced fascism and war and imperialism. And the brilliant thing about the European Union and its great success was it was a method of dealing with the excesses of the nation state. And I think it has to develop more as a new model that is appropriate for the 21st century. And that does mean being a different kind of animal that's not a nation state, that is, as I said, a model of global governance. I think on the issue of free capital movement, I just think there's something deeply wrong with our narrative at the moment, that we don't think free movement of labor is a good in itself. We think we can talk about controlling the movement of labor, but somehow we do think free movement of capital is a good in itself, and it's completely the wrong way around, in my view. The free movement of labor is about human right to mobility. It's a human right. Capital is a question to be discussed and developed. Like you, I'm against protectionism. Mm-hmm. But I do think we have to regulate financial flows, which we are failing to do utterly. And I do think, like you, we need very fundamental structural changes at all levels of society. But I think that means we need a new political model in order to manage those structural changes. And I think the EU has that capacity. But we need to develop a different narrative to make that possible.
Well, thank you very much to Stijn Hoorens, to Ibon Juaristi, and to Mary Kaldor, and to all of you for participating in this session. I think it has been inspiring, very large subject, very few time, but I think that many ideas to be developed, and I think that will be part, I hope, the success of this conference, where the ESC and myself, as Secretary General of the ESC, we support a lot.